Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Today I'm joined by Kirstine Taylor, Associate Professor of Political Science and Law, Justice and Culture at Ohio University. She discusses her article, Racial Capitalism and the Production of Innocence. James Baldwin's concept of racial innocence has been understood as a matter of practiced unconsciousness about the reality of racism in the United States. Taylor revisits his essays highlighting racial capitalism to show how segregated urban space, racialized labor relations, and policing contribute to Baldwin's racial innocence. Here is our discussion from September 5, 2025.
My name is Kirstine Taylor, and I'm currently on faculty at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And I'm housed in two locations there, actually. I'm in the political science department, and then I'm also a faculty member in the Center for Law, Justice, and Culture. So I teach in both places there.
Well, it sounds like you're pretty busy. So thank you for joining us, giving us some time today. We're going to be talking about an article you wrote a couple of years ago now called Racial Capitalism and the Production of Racial Innocence. Mm-hmm. And this deals with primarily James Baldwin's thinking. So could you begin by telling us how you came to Baldwin and then how you came to look at these two particular aspects of his thinking?
Yes, of course. So I came to Baldwin in graduate school. I had a mentor in grad school named Jack Turner, and he introduced me to James Baldwin's writings. He is a specialist. He is still at the institution I got my PhD at, which is University of Washington in Seattle. And he studies, among other things, he studies African American political thought. And so I began reading Black political thought and American political thought more broadly under him. And that it was in those sessions where I was really introduced to his political thought. At the same time as all of that was taking place, I was also taking courses with another professor who is no longer at University of Washington, but at the time she was teaching there. Her name is Naomi Murakawa, and she is a scholar of African American political thought, but also U.S. institutions, U.S. politics, and primarily U.S. racial politics around incarceration and policing. And so I was taking these courses on Baldwin's political thought, and then simultaneously these courses on how the American state had developed and what roles prisons and policing and race were playing in those developments. And there was something about the combination, I think, of those two thinkers in my life, those two instructors in my life who were talking on the one hand about political thought and the importance of really taking seriously the Black political tradition and political theory coming out of Black struggle. And then a scholar who was so focused on why the state is formed the way it does and why it lands with such force on Black Americans. And so it was that combination, I think, got me to understand Baldwin in a new way and really has informed my thinking ever since. So that's kind of how I approached it, both from a very just kind of organic in the classroom way, but then also being treated to thinking that what is happening in people's thoughts is very important. And then also on the ground, what is happening is very important. And you can kind of see both of those aspects in the article.
Yeah, and you do a pretty good job of making both of those stand out. So I'd like you to begin, before we get into Baldwin's thought, just give us a one or two sentence background on who Baldwin was, the difference between his kind of fiction and nonfiction and political thinking, and how he has kind of loomed over the first part of the 21st century.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So James Baldwin, he was born in the 1920s. lived for 60 something years, died in the late 80s. He was born in Harlem in New York City. And at a very young age, he was primed by his father, I believe, to become a preacher, a career that he gave up at the young age of 17. And he moved. And that's like as he was starting to write more and more. And he started out as a novelist more than anything else. And he wrote several novels. Another Country is one. But he had several, and then simultaneously found himself doing a lot of political writing, and in part this was a product, at least in my understanding, of his involvement in I wouldn't say I hesitate to say the civil rights movement. Of course, he was very involved in the civil rights movement, but he was involved more broadly in Black's political struggle, from a thinker standpoint, a writer standpoint, and an activist standpoint. So he was deeply involved in all those conversations unfolding nationally, and also stood somewhat apart of any particular organization. So he wasn't, for instance, an MLK figure where he's leading, right? He's someone who is both involved and also always a little bit outside and able to speak from both perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, and he, I mean, kind of tangentially, he was also a gay man who fled the country at some point and then came back and kind of, um,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's all part of his
Yes.
biography.
Yeah.
So, could you please explain to us this notion he develops around racial innocence? Because I think before we talk about your thinking, we have to talk about his thinking. And yeah, what was he thinking?
Great question. What was he thinking? Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that the concept of racial innocence is it's only a piece of Baldwin's writing. I mean, you can sort of understand already from my description of him as a novelist and an essayist, and he gives speeches and interviews, and it's just he just strikes me as one of those people. Not that I would really know, but was just constantly writing, And so he has quite a body of work, and it is very rich. And one of the lines of thinking that has really struck me, and I'm not the only one. There's a whole set of scholars and activists and people who are really interested in this concept that he produces, which is racial innocence. So I think that concept is really productive. And it's productive because what he's talking about is a kind of, in some places, he talks about it as a sort of, there's a double crime to the nation. There's a sort of set of foundational crimes that we did as a country. And those crimes involve the institution of chattel slavery, the commodification of Black people across the Atlantic that then were sold on markets and forced into labor and treated, of course, very horribly for the exploitation of their labor. It also includes settler colonialism. It includes all kinds of other histories that we might name. It includes things in the present, like racial segregation, incarceration, etc. These are he articulates them as sort of a founding crime. He uses the word crime a lot in these terms. And then he says, like, this is what we've done. And in some places in his writing, he makes it very clear that we are not the only country to do things of this nature. That he says people treat each other very badly and always have, and maybe always will. But what makes the US different in some ways is that there's a second crime that has taken place. And the second crime is that we've denied the first one, that we've become, in his terminology, innocent of the foundational crimes of the country. And so it's this unseeingness that he names as innocence, and that he thinks of as, in some cases, he describes it as even worse than the original, because to not be able to see what you have done to other human beings is for him almost a greater sin than the commitment of the original. So we can maybe take him seriously on that point. We can also give him a little bit of grace there. But regardless, this is what he kind of means by innocence, broadly speaking, is just our, and he speaks in terms of our a lot, or the we a lot, to say sort of generally in the country about how people have denied what it is that they have done, both historically and in the present moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and he says, and I love this about his writing, which is that he tends to universalize the crimes of the country, but then personalizes the experience of Black America. So he says, like, I am, this, I am that, and I am the history of slavery and that kind of stuff. So when he's talking about the we, he's bringing Black people into it, but he's mainly talking about white
Yeah.
bad consciousness, white racial innocence, right? I mean, this is what we're kind of talking about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think he kind of floats in between those two things a lot, or maybe I should say three things. There's, of course, he thinks the coercive force of the country has landed on the backs of Black Americans. And then he also says this has been paired with or married with a kind of unconsciousness of racism by white people. He also uses the we in terms of the country, like what the country has done. And so there's this slippage between the country and white Americans sometimes in his writing, where he wants to kind of say that the nation has done this thing. And then also he does point to white consciousness or misconsciousness or unconsciousness, right, as being a particular problem, the particular crime, right? Again, there's a sort of tethering between the nation and the we that he uses, and then what is happening in the kind of minds of white people from his perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about how he kind of defines that white consciousness, because that's where he sort of ends it, right? His solution is action, but it's based in this idea of white consciousness of the crime, therefore denying the second crime, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So, as you might imagine, if you're concerned, as Baldwin is concerned, about the yeah, the kind of ways in which white innocence or racial innocence is occurring for white people or the nation more broadly, um, then you might sort of say, like, a wake up. Sort of like, how is it that we can become, this is how a lot of scholars have talked about Baldwin's thinking around the solutions to the problem that innocence poses for the country is one of, like, can you awaken to it? Can you become conscious rather than unconscious? And this is really present in his writing in a lot of ways. So there are passages that I point to in the article where he really talks about consciousness as a kind of antidote, that it's in the it that there's like some kind of democratic promise for us in awakening, in refusing to slumber on this, to um yeah, to become not only conscious but thoughtful about the ways that the nation has harmed and continues to harm Black Americans, right? And so I think that this is a really big strain in his writing. I also think, though, that it has that we in this sentence, meaning scholars, of Baldwin's theorization of innocence have kind of a little bit overindulged a bit in this language of consciousness as being the antidote. Because there's other parts of his writing where he tries to make clear that he actually says in some cases it's very hard to act on what you know. And the the willful soul is actually quite rare, right? So you can be awake all you want, but how is it that you can fix the structures and the histories that have produced innocence? It takes something deeper than simply becoming knowledgeable about it, and even deeper than thinking about yourself in relationship to those structures. So he's after, I think, in many places in his writing, thinking about innocence in structural terms, not just what is happening in people's minds, but what is offered to them continually by the way they move around a physical environment, how they move socially, how they move politically. And so there's these structures that he talks about from time to time in his writing, or I should say throughout his writing, where he's trying to say, I think he's trying to say, yes, we can awaken the mind, we can become conscious of these elements that are foreclosing our ability to understand the racial nature of our nation and its harms and its violences. But also become conscious all you want. We have to take seriously what has produced those places of innocence to begin with, if that makes some amount of sense.
Well,
As
it
a
does. And I think it ties into that mutual consciousness that is talked about, and the idea that, you can dismantle white supremacy in the mind, in the
Yeah.
consciousness of a white person. You and I can dismantle white supremacy in our thinking, but we're still trapped in the history of white supremacy. We still are living among these systems and history that is not yet untangled. So if I understand where you kind of jump in with the structural piece, you
Yeah.
kind of pick that up and run a little bit harder at it than I think other people have. So if you could tell us kind of where your thinking of the structuralism comes in to how you adapt Baldwin's thought to that and how you think he's pick that apart a little bit more, I guess, is what I'm trying to explore.
Yeah, of course. I would be happy to. So, yeah, on my reading, I think that Baldwin himself is a little bit at odds with consciousness being the antidote to racial innocence. Again, we might think that we can simply wake up and become conscious of things and start thinking about things, and very often I think that's where people start, right? Inevitably, that's where people start. It starts with some thoughts. But of course, he's also concerned about these structures that, at least on my reading of him, that produce um, racial innocence. And his thinking on this is really layered. I like to start with what seems to be an example from his writing that is outside of the realm of innocence, but I think it unlocks something in his political philosophy around innocence. So if I can like read a little bit of text to you. So this is from one of his most famous works. It's from The Fire Next Time, and it's from a particular part of that, which is his letter to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So he writes to his nephew, whose name is also James. He calls him Big James in the letter, writing that he was a big baby. So he calls him Big James, even though, of course, James Baldwin is the elder and the uncle. So he says in an early part of the letter, which is very short, it's only maybe 5 or 6 pages long. He says, quote, "Other people cannot see what I see whenever I looked into your father's face. For behind your father's face, as it is today, are all those other faces which were his. Let him laugh, and I see a cellar he does not remember, and a house he does not remember, and I hear in his present laughter his laughter as a child. And first of all, I think this passage is really beautiful. And he goes on to talk a little bit about, his brother and a little bit more about his family. But there's something really important about his thinking here, I think, because if you think about like a face that you've known for years, right? What Baldwin is saying here is that he can look at a present face, the face of his brother as he exists today, and see all the faces behind it, which were his. So he's imagining past experiences, past forms of his brother that aren't clear to anyone unless they've known history of his family or known his brother for a long time. And he can also hear in his laughter as a little kid, right? So there's this idea that there are these layers of history that are discernible if you know how to look and if you know how to read that face. And I think he approaches his like present American context with the same focus, right? The same ability to see into the past and to bring that past into the present, right? So the way I kind of approach that in the article is to suggest that when he's looking at something like the history of chattel slavery, so Baldwin, as I said at the beginning, was born in the 1920s, like well past the demise of slavery, the end of slavery in the US. And yet in another writing, he says something like, I picked cotton. I think you referenced this earlier, right? Baldwin is saying, and then he pauses and he says, I'm speaking very seriously. I picked cotton and I brought it to the market. And he's placing himself in the history, which I think is a way of saying that the nation's history of slavery and what it did to people, to Black people, is present in the conditions of his life as he was living them when he was writing in the 1960s, this passage, right? So if you're looking structurally, in other words, you have to be able to discern the structures of slavery, and I think in some ways they're market relationships, right? There's like a hint of looking at capitalism and the way it was functioning to exploit people, to extract their labor, and then to connect that with race in his writing. And so as he's looking at the present, he is seeing how the structures of the past have informed it. And he's also saying that, like, when, in this passage about his brother's face and his laughter, Baldwin knows how to look, but an outsider wouldn't, right? Someone not in the family or someone who hasn't studied that face would have no idea what his laughter sounded like as a child or what his face as a baby looked like, but Baldwin can just see it on him. And I think this is an analog to innocence, right? That if we don't know how to look and we don't know how to interpret American history, we're going to be innocent of the ways in which it informs the present, and we're going to be innocent, that is like unseeing, of the violences that it continues to wrought because we haven't reckoned with it fully. So that's kind of how I approach it in part. I hope that made some amount of sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that, I think one of the things that struck me about that passage that you wrote and also what Baldwin said is this idea that our past is not always a memory we share. So even though individuals can have the same, on an individual basis, his brother doesn't remember playing in the cellar when he was too young to form memories, but James does, Baldwin does. And then there's a larger issue, which is the country
Yeah.
has a past that it's trying not to remember.
Yes.
And one group of people has to remember it because the structural, as you said, reality lives on,
Yeah.
and that he can say, I picked cotton and mean it, whereas a white person doesn't identify with the I owned slaves.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's where like the disconnect between there's a past that I refuse, as a white person, to have a memory of.
Yes, yes, a refuse. I like your language there of a refusal of memory. There's also an element, and for this, I'll draw in another history that he attends to from time to time in his writing, which is that of the kind of settler colonial. He doesn't use that term exactly, settler colonialism, but he says something like, in order to create the country, we had to do a couple of things. We imported and commodified African people, and then sold them and made them work under a system of enslavement. That was one thing we did to create the country. And he means that in a like, no, that really created the country, like in terms of the wealth, in terms of um the physicality, like we wouldn't have a nation but for, or certainly we would have a very different kind of nation but for the labor that we relied on um of enslaved people. So this is one history. The other history that he talks about is that of indigenous people in the US and how he says he says that we essentially, when we settled the country, the other thing we had to do was take land, right? And in order to take land, in order to settle, we killed we killed people. And then he says something really crucial in this passage, which is that we did remember it, actually. We just remembered it not as a massacre, but as a legend, right? So we created a narrative out of it that was celebratory, and it like tastes like candy in our mouths. Like he doesn't use the word candy there, but like he says there's a confection to it, that there's a production of something sweet out of something incredibly bitter. And so there's something about, both by innocence, he means a kind of thoughtless removal, like we actually don't know our history. But then he also is suggesting at the same time that we know it in a particular way, which is as a celebration, as a legend, and as a, like he says we wear our history as we might wear like medals on a field of battle, right? As a kind of like armor to not know, but then also there's something celebratory about it. So there's kind of both elements to that, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, transforming the racial injustice into redemption stories, into these celebratory. I mean, the gunfighter cowboy is. I had a professor in college who said it is the King Arthur myth of America. So
Yes.
knights in shining armor are our cowboys and Clint Eastwoods and those guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
But let's talk about, because I found this incredibly fascinating, the racial capitalism aspect and how you deal with his Baldwin's idea of the ghetto as part of the second crime of racial innocence, but this also the idea of the intersectionality of spaces and environments, because I think that's something that when we think of structural racism, it's very easy to kind of get lost in the heady 3,000-foot view when you're talking about locations and housing and ghettos, it becomes very concrete. So if you could talk about the racial capitalism in that regard, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you reminded us about the term racial capitalism, right? Which is all in the article, and of course is a completely borrowed concept from Cedric Robinson, among who coined the term, among others, who sort of talk about capitalism as always inherently racial in character, both in the U.S. and worldwide. Essentially, that there's always this racial kind of underpinning to the way that capital circulates, and that has changed over time. And of course, we're not in a period of enslavement currently, and so the question is like, as important as Baldwin thinks the past is for understanding the present, those like faces behind the faces, he's very concerned with what is unfurling right now in the present, right? In his present, 1950s, 60s, 70s, when he's writing. Primarily, I work with a lot of his writings in the 60s. And so one of the things he talks about, as you noted, was the ghetto. He, in particular, is talking about Harlem quite often in his writings. And there's one image that I was really struck by when reading him all those years ago in grad school. And it's an image of the um, the neighborhood of Harlem, which he calls in the 1960s, he calls a ghetto, by which he means, I say this in the piece, but he doesn't mean it in a pejorative way. He means it in a more technical way, which is a place of enclosure and a place of policing, and that there's boundaries around racial boundaries around the neighborhood, that it's like at your peril that you cross them, right? And so it's about the kind of boundaries of racial containment, which are produced both because of poverty, but also because of policies like redlining and histories of housing segregation. And there's many ingredients to that reality. Um, but he offers us in one of his writings, one of his essays, an image of Harlem, and he describes it in terminology of enclosure. He talks about the actual roads that bind the neighborhood. That he says at one point, like, we did not live beyond these streets, which is like this idea of not living beyond, right? Has this um, feeling of stuckness, of enclosure, of almost an open air prison, right? And then he describes the poverty of the neighborhood and the sort of lack of ability to make profits there, the fact that people work and work and work, but are not succeeding in amassing wealth, and are not succeeding in being able to move out of their neighborhoods and into a better one, right? And so he's describing this as all happening or occurring on a corner of Fifth Avenue in Harlem. And then he says, as almost like a throwaway line in a parenthetical, where he says, this is the same Fifth Avenue as in Midtown, like the other end of Fifth is a wide boulevard in Midtown that is, I forget exactly the terminology he uses, but it's respectable, it's moneyed, it's a actual producer of capital, like the office buildings along this street in Midtown Manhattan produce incredible wealth, right? And house incredible wealth. They house offices in neighborhoods that are filled with white people, but they're also just filled with capital. They're filled with wealth. And so this, for me, I was just thinking in my mind as I was reading that passage from him, that like there's something to it, that that's the same avenue, right? Physically speaking, it's the same avenue. And so there's a tethering for him of the enclosed poverty of the ghetto and the moneyed profit-making wealth of white Manhattan. And that these, for him, are not only physically connected, and it's not like they happen to be the same road, like there's something deeper that he's trying to say in this pairing of both ends of Fifth Avenue. And I think it's that it absent Black poverty and the kind of actual labor that goes into that, you don't get the white wealth that is produced elsewhere. And so there's a relationship there that he's trying to discern. And then the way that this is connected to innocence is, he says essentially this produces racial innocence in its very structure. Why? Because white people are not traveling into Harlem, or I should say, very few of them are traveling into Harlem. However, the residents of Harlem are continually traveling outside of its boundaries in order to labor, right? So W.E.B. Du Bois would have called this a double consciousness, right? Where Black residents of Harlem would have a consciousness not only of their neighborhood and understanding of their neighborhood, but they would understand how they were seen by the white world. That's a kind of Du Boisian concept. But for Baldwin, he's thinking about it in terms of like, this is what flips the rose-colored glasses over the eyes of white Americans is it's produced and reinforced by an actual physical distance from knowledge, right? So they can read in books and they can try to understand, but intrinsically, they're almost always like coaxed into innocence again, just in their daily lives, and how very removed it is from understanding the enclosure of the ghetto and then the policing, the violences of the ghetto. And so for him, I think, yeah, there's that double crime. There's the actual violence of living there, the enclosure of living there, the impoverishment involved in a ghetto. And then there's also like it's productive of the innocence by which white people, are simply not seeing. And this is from the structure itself.
Right. I think in the article you mentioned, or you coin it kind of as, it's not just not seen, it's unseen.
Yeah.
And it's a willful um, act of denial, but also a denial of the denial, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about the racial containment aspect of the ghetto, because there's the quote you bring into the article about, he's basically saying that, the black people have it very bad in the South, and he's often asked, why don't they move north? And it ends with this great, they do not escape Jim Crow, they merely encounter another, not less deadly variety. They do not move to Chicago, they move to the south side. They do not move to New York, they move to Harlem. So could you talk a little bit more, and I think this brings in some of the policing that you were talking about and how you came to some of this, but racial capitalism is determinant on this confinement and making sure that there's it's almost a recasting of slavery in a kind of abstract sense, right? Where we're confining a certain part of the labor to a very racially coded zone, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say, I mean, more about, I love that you brought in that line from him. He that line about people, I mean, Black people don't move north to freedom. They move to Chicago South Side. They don't move to New York. They move to Harlem, which is to say, like, they move to racial enclosure that is exploited. and and to connect it to police, since that was part of can I read a little bit more? Okay. I'm gonna break out my copy of Baldwin's collective essays for this one. I think I have it noted. I wanted to sorry, there's someone on my porch outside. I was just looking. Okay, so to get to his understanding of how policing is related to this, there's a passage from, this is the same piece, I think, that I was talking about before with the Fifth Avenue element, and it's called Fifth Avenue Uptown. That's the name of the essay. And partway through it, he says, this is a quoting from him. He says, the only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. And I want us to think, maybe, I don't want to place us too much in our own time, but it's worth kind of thinking about what is happening not only in American cities, but maybe also what had happened earlier this year in Los Angeles and is happening, at least as we're recording now, in Washington, D.C., with the increased police presence and the National Guard troops being deployed on the streets of the nation's capital. So maybe that could maybe be a little bit in the background of this as well. So he, again, to quote, the only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. None of the police commissioners' men, even with the best will in the world, have any way of understanding the lives led by the people they swagger about in twos and threes, um, controlling. Their very this is the line I kind of wanted to get to. Their very presence, Baldwin writes, is an insult. And it would be, even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to children. They represent the force of the white world, and that world's real intentions are simply for that world's criminal profit and ease, to keep the Black man corralled up here in his place. And then to just read one more line, he says, the badge, the gun in the holster, and the swinging club make vivid what will happen should his rebellion become overt, right? So if you're thinking about being enclosed as he experiences the ghetto, and being, if you were to cross that boundary, that neighborhood boundary, risks are imminent, right? He's essentially saying that the policeman's job, more than what we would hope and expect, which is like to for public safety or to solve crimes or to keep the public, I know, safe or secure in some way. He experiences the police as and as a political entity that is there to patrol the boundaries of the ghetto, and within it to even if they're armed with gumdrops, with candies rather than a gun, even if they're like coaxing people with kindness and words, right? There's something about it is they're there for the protection of white capital over the actual people that they're policing, right? So they're there to control the residents of the ghetto. That's in his conception. So maybe that gets us some way to thinking about the fact that, yeah, as much as Baldwin is concerned about the past, he's very concerned about where is it that people are arriving when they come from down south and up north. You know, they arrive in these neighborhoods and they encounter they might have escaped Bull Connor in Birmingham, right? But they arrive and they're policed in a different way, right? In a way that is no less violent on Baldwin's conception. Yeah.
Well, and thinking about it territorially, just specifically territorially, that if you confine a group of people to a certain area and then allow them to leave into an into an even more dangerous for them environment, which is the white neighborhood, a white upscale neighborhood. And we've seen this over and over again where walking while black, driving while black happens, where white people will see a black person and call the police. They're immediately criminalized when in those spaces. So when they return to their own spaces, they have to be immediately criminalized there as well in order for white supremacy to have its structural hold, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting to me also in Baldwin's writing is I talk about sort of some of the history of housing segregation and neighborhood segregation in the article. And one of the entities that Baldwin does not let off the hook are a group he calls liberal reformers. And he says, like, okay, so if the ghetto is a space of enclosure, one thing you might expect for people who find themselves contained and enclosed with guns or gumdrops, either one, is they might start to push back against those boundaries in some ways. In other words, they might rebel. And of course, this has happened. Whether that rebellion is a kind of uprising or whether it is a nonviolent protest, there are ways that people are rebelling in their with their bodies or in their spirits or with their words in some way. And so there have been various uprisings in Harlem. And Baldwin points to them and he says, you know, these liberal reformers in the city come in and they like form their commissions and they like get down to business. And the business that they get down to in order to solve the problem of Black rebellion in Harlem and other places is to simply build newer places within the ghetto for them to live, right? So Baldwin talks about these like new housing, new public housing structures as like, sure, they're new, but they're also evidence of how, for Black people, they're evidence of like how much they are despised and how little regard white policymakers, liberal or conservative, have for them, right? And so he really takes to task these reformers. And he says something really crucial and that I try to take really seriously towards the end of the article, which is he says, there's only one way to improve a ghetto. And here I'm actually quoting him. There's only one way to improve a ghetto out of existence, right? So if you want to actually attend to the problems, the violences, the poverty within a ghetto or within a poor neighborhood, poor racialized neighborhood, what you have to do is abolish the conditions of that neighborhood. You don't like put more police on the ground. You don't like give slightly better structures. He says that's evidence of that's what it's like to be institutionally despised or politically despised, right? He uses this terminology from time to time. And so people are smart. They know this by the fact of how they're living, right? And so if you want to actually improve anything, you have to abolish the conditions of the ghetto itself, right? So I quite like that line from him because he really is, yeah, he really takes no prisoners on that argument. Yeah.
Well, and that section too in your paper was very good because I thought his description of like they'll make the minuscule little change, white liberals will, and then call it racial justice. See,
Yes.
see what we've done for you? We've created racial justice, and it has done nothing but, as you were saying, kind of tighten the locks on the doors. Um, so, kind of wrapping up, I've written down in my notes here that white people willfully ignore race for any other explanation. So, kind of using that as to wrap it up, if that's the case, where do we go and how do we challenge that? Not only in Baldwin's arguments, but your interpretation of his argument.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think you sort of have to do it all. At some point, I say this in the article that Baldwin sort of eschews doctrine, where he says that he likes to be suspicious of all theories. But I also think that he takes on so much. This is why at some points in my drafting of this article, I thought, Baldwin he disregards consciousness, or he doesn't think that's so important. He really is all about the structure. And then I was reading him more, I'm like, no, he takes seriously that side. He takes it quite seriously. And so I think part of the like what is to be done is doing kind of what we're doing here and what countless people do in their classrooms or in their own groups and in their own communities, which is to talk with each other about these things, right? And so in other words, as you're talking to people about these sorts of issues, you are raising people's consciousness, right? You are making people more thoughtful about the things that Baldwin is concerned about and that people today, of course, are concerned about as well. Um, And so this is part of the game, right? And he's very explicit in parts of his writing about like it takes conscious people to actually make any changes. And at the same time, I think he's really onto something when he says there's only one way to fix a ghetto, and that's to disappear it, to abolish it. And I think there's something to that too. So that takes action. And it takes mass movement, and I think it takes policymakers that are willing. And if you're hearing something in the background, that's my dog dreaming. I don't know if you can hear that, but
Oh, I can't hear it.
in dreaming.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.